The gunfire had stopped echoing through Willowcreek's dusty main street hours ago, but Willa Lockhart couldn't bring herself to leave the back room of the general store where she'd taken shelter. The windows had been shot out, and the late summer night air drifted in, carrying the scent of smoke and spent gunpowder. She rested her forehead against the rough-hewn wooden wall, exhausted but too terrified to close her eyes. It was 1878, and the small Wyoming Territory town had seen its share of trouble, but nothing like today's chaos. The outlaw gang had descended on Willowcreek just after noon. 6 men with faces hidden behind bandanas and pistols drawn. They'd robbed the bank and shot Sheriff Davis when he'd tried to intervene. In the ensuing gunfight, the general store had become Willa's refuge. The lamps that normally illuminated the store had long since burned low, their oil depleted, leaving her in near darkness. She heard footsteps on the wooden porch outside, heavy boots. A man. Willa's heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself deeper into the shadows, clutching the small Derringer pistol her father had given her before she'd left Missouri. The footsteps paused at the door, and she heard the creak of it swinging open. "Hello? Anybody still in here?" The voice was deep but gentle, not the harsh bark of the outlaws who had terrorized the town. Willa remained silent, her fingers white-knuckled around her gun. A match struck in the darkness, its sudden flare illuminating a face. High cheekbones, a strong jaw with several days' worth of stubble, and eyes that crinkled at the corners as he smiled reassuringly. He held the match up higher, the flame casting golden light across his features. He wasn't wearing a badge, but something about him radiated authority and safety. "Madam, it's all right. They're gone. You can come out now." Willa hesitated, then lowered her Derringer. "They killed the sheriff." The match burned down to his fingers, and he dropped it, striking another. "I know. I'm Thomas Vance. The town council telegraphed for help yesterday. Seems I arrived a few hours too late." He moved slowly toward the counter, finding an oil lamp and lighting it with his match. The warm glow spread through the ransacked store. Willa stepped cautiously from the shadows. "I'm Willa Lockhart. I work here for Mr. Peterson." Thomas Vance nodded, his eyes taking in her appearance. Her honey-blonde hair had come loose from its pins, and dust covered her simple blue dress. She knew she must look a fright, but something in his gaze made her feel strangely seen, rather than judged. "Are you hurt, Miss Lockhart?" "No, just shaken." She glanced around the destroyed store. "Mr. Peterson was out making deliveries when it happened. I hope he's all right. The doctor's looking after the wounded at his office. I'll take you there, if you'd like." He offered his arm, and Willa noticed the star pinned to his vest for the first time. "You're a marshal?" "Yes, madam. U.S. Marshal Thomas Vance." He smiled again, and despite everything, Willa felt a flutter of something other than fear in her chest. "I've been tracking the Clayton gang for 3 months now. They've hit 4 towns before this one." Willa accepted his arm, steadying herself. Did you catch them?" His expression darkened. "Got 2 of them. The others, including Jim Clayton himself, rode out north. But I'll find them." There was something in his voice, a quiet determination, that Willa found both frightening and reassuring. As they stepped out onto the street, Willa saw the aftermath of the attack for the first time. Broken windows, overturned wagons, and townspeople emerging cautiously from hiding places. 2 sheet-covered bodies lay in front of the bank. "Is that—" "Sheriff Davis and one of the outlaws," Thomas confirmed quietly. "The other dead man is at the livery." Willa looked away, swallowing hard. She had only lived in Willowcreek for 6 months since arriving from St. Louis. The small frontier town had been peaceful, if a bit rough around the edges. Now it seemed as vulnerable as she felt. At the doctor's office, they found Mr. Peterson with a bandaged arm, but otherwise unharmed. The kindly older man who owned the general store insisted Willa go home and rest. "There's nothing to be done tonight, my dear," he said. "We'll start cleaning up tomorrow." Thomas Vance offered to walk her home. As they made their way through the darkened streets, Willa became acutely aware of his presence beside her, tall and solid. Her small rented room was above the milliner's shop at the end of town. "Will you be staying in Willowcreek long, Marshal Vance?" she asked as they reached her door. He looked out toward the horizon, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky. "Until I've caught Jim Clayton. He's hurt too many people, and Willowcreek won't be the last town he terrorizes if I don't stop him. Willa nodded, unlocking her door. Thank you for seeing me home safely. He touched the brim of his hat. Lock your door, Miss Lockhart, and if you need anything, I'll be staying at the hotel. As she closed her door, Willa couldn't help but think that Marshal Thomas Vance was unlike any man she had met before. There was something in his eyes, a haunted quality that spoke of things seen and done that most people couldn't imagine. Yet when he had struck that match in the darkness of the general store and smiled at her, she had felt, for the first time since the shooting started, that everything might eventually be all right. The next morning, Willa woke to the sounds of the town coming back to life. Hammers pounded as men repaired broken windows and doors. Wagons creaked along the streets. Life in Willowcreek was continuing, despite the terror of the previous day. She dressed quickly in a simple brown skirt and white blouse, pinning her hair up neatly. Mr. Peterson had told her not to worry about coming in today, but she couldn't stay alone in her room with her thoughts. The general store needed cleaning, and work would keep her mind occupied. When she arrived at the store, she found Marshal Vance already there, helping Mr. Peterson sweep up shattered glass. He looked up as the bell above the door jingled, and for a moment, their eyes met. He had shaved, she noticed, and looked less rough around the edges in the morning light. Miss Lockhart, he greeted her, I didn't expect to see you here today. I thought I might help, she replied, reaching for an apron hanging behind the counter. There's much to be done. Mr. Peterson shook his head. You shouldn't have come in, Willa, after what you went through yesterday. I'd rather be busy than sitting alone with my thoughts, she interrupted gently. Please, Mr. Peterson. The older man nodded in understanding. Very well. Perhaps you could take inventory of what's left. The outlaws took most of our cash, but they also helped themselves to tobacco, ammunition, and some canned goods. As Willa began her work, she was acutely aware of Thomas Vance's presence. He worked silently, efficiently, helping to right overturned shelves and sweep up debris. Occasionally, she would glance up to find him watching her, his expression unreadable. By midday, the store was beginning to look presentable again. Mr. Peterson insisted on closing early and invited both Willa and the marshal to join him for lunch at the small cafe down the street. As they walked, Willa noticed the black bunting hung on the sheriff's office and felt a renewed sense of loss. When will they bury Sheriff Davis? She asked quietly. Tomorrow, Thomas replied. I've sent telegrams to his family in Denver. They should arrive by then. Did you know him? Mr. Peterson asked the marshal. Thomas shook his head. No, but I've known men like him. Good lawmen who died trying to protect their towns. There was that darkness in his eyes again, and Willa wondered how many such men he had known. At the cafe, they were joined by Mayor Harrington, a portly man with a thick mustache who seemed more concerned with the town's reputation than the loss of its sheriff. This is terrible for business, he complained, stirring sugar into his coffee. Just when we were starting to attract more settlers, now we'll be known as another lawless frontier town. With respect, Mayor, Thomas said evenly, what Willowcreek needs now is a new sheriff, someone who knows the territory and can keep order while I track down the rest of the Clayton gang. The mayor snorted. And where exactly am I supposed to find such a person? Davis was barely keeping up as it was. What about Deputy Foster? Willa suggested. Mayor Harrington shook his head. Young Foster's good with a gun, but he doesn't have the experience. Besides, he took a bullet in the shoulder yesterday. He'll be laid up for weeks. Thomas leaned forward. I might have a suggestion. An old friend of mine, Samuel Turner, retired from the Rangers last year. He's been looking for somewhere quieter to settle down. I could telegraph him. The conversation continued around her, but Willa found herself watching Thomas. Despite his relatively clean appearance, there was no disguising what he was, a man accustomed to violence and hardship. His hands bore calluses and small scars, and when he moved, she could see the outline of his pistol beneath his coat. Yet there was a gentleness to him too, evident in the way he spoke to Mr. Peterson, and the respectful tone he used even with the blustering mayor. After lunch, Thomas excused himself to send telegrams from the station. Willa returned to the store with Mr. Peterson, but her thoughts remained with the marshal. He was a mystery to her, a dangerous man with kind eyes. A man who had seen terrible things yet could still strike a match in the darkness and offer a reassuring smile. That evening, as Willa was closing up the store, The door opened, and Thomas walked in. He removed his hat, revealing hair the color of dark coffee that curled slightly at his temples. "Miss Lockhart, I was hoping to find you still here." Willa's heart quickened inexplicably. "I was just finishing up, Marshal." "Thomas," he corrected her. "When I'm not officially tracking outlaws, I prefer Thomas." She smiled despite herself. "Was there something you needed, Thomas?" He stepped further into the store, his spurs making soft jingling sounds on the wooden floor. "I wanted to ask if you'd seen or heard anything unusual before the robbery yesterday. Anything that might help me track them." Willa thought back to the hours before the attack. There were 3 men who came into the store early in the morning. They weren't local, and they asked a lot of questions about the bank when it opened. How many people worked there? Thomas's expression sharpened. "Can you describe them?" She nodded, recalling the men clearly. One was tall with a red beard. Another had a scar across his cheek right here. She traced a line across her own face. The third was younger, maybe 20, dark-haired with a missing front tooth. "Jim Clayton, Ezra Doyle, and probably young Billy Mercer," Thomas said, more to himself than to her. "They were casing the town?" "I didn't think anything of it at the time," Willa admitted. "We get plenty of strangers passing through." "You've been very helpful." He hesitated, then added, "I'm heading out at first light tomorrow to track them. They had a wounded man with them, which will slow them down. With luck, I'll catch up to them within a few days." Willa felt a strange tightness in her chest at the thought of him leaving. "Will you be going alone?" "Foster's deputizing a few men to come with me, but they'll only slow me down if we have to move fast." His eyes met hers. "I wanted to thank you for your help today, and to tell you to be careful while I'm gone. Clayton might have friends we don't know about." "I will," she promised. "And be careful yourself, Thomas. From what I've heard, Jim Clayton doesn't surrender easily." A ghost of a smile crossed his features. "No outlaw ever does." He put his hat back on, touching the brim in farewell. "Good night, Miss Lockhart." "Willa," she corrected him softly. "If you're Thomas, then I'm Willa." His smile widened. "Good night, Willa." After he left, Willa found herself standing in the quiet store, the oil lamp on the counter casting long shadows. She had known the marshal for barely a day, yet the thought of him riding out to confront dangerous outlaws filled her with dread. Thomas Vance was still a stranger, but somehow, in the aftermath of violence, he had become important to her. She extinguished the lamp and locked the door behind her, walking home through the twilight. Willowcreek was quieter than usual, its inhabitants still shaken by yesterday's events. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Willa wondered what had brought her to this point, a young woman alone in a frontier town, finding herself concerned for a man who lived with danger as his constant companion. She had come west for a new beginning after her father's death left her alone in the world. The small inheritance he'd left hadn't gone far in St. Louis, but it had been enough to bring her to Wyoming territory and start a modest new life. She had hoped for adventure, yes, but not the kind that left men dead in the street and a marshal with haunted eyes riding into danger. The next morning, Willa rose before dawn. She dressed quickly and made her way to the livery stable, where she knew Thomas would be preparing to leave. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when she arrived, finding him saddling a sturdy chestnut gelding. He looked up in surprise. "Willa, what are you doing here so early?" She held out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Provisions for your journey, just some bread, dried beef, and coffee." Thomas accepted the package, their fingers brushing momentarily. "Thank you, that's very thoughtful. It's the least I could do after you helped at the store yesterday." She hesitated, then added, "How long do you think you'll be gone?" He secured the provisions in his saddlebag. "Hard to say. Depends on how far they've gotten and whether they're sticking to the main trails." He checked his pistol, then slid it back into its holster. "I hope to be back within a week." Willa nodded, suddenly feeling foolish for coming. What was Thomas Vance to her, after all? Just a lawman doing his job? Yet something in her had needed to see him before he left, to offer this small gesture of support. "Well, I should let you finish your preparations," she said, turning to go. "Willa," he called after her. When she turned back, he was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I appreciate you coming." 3 men on horseback approached the livery deputy Foster with his arm in a sling and 2 others Willa recognized as local ranchers. Foster nodded to Thomas. "We're ready when you are, Marshal." Thomas acknowledged them with a nod, then turned back to Willa. "Take care while I'm gone." "You too," she replied softly. She stepped back as Thomas mounted his horse, watching as the small posse rode out of town, heading north into the rolling Wyoming landscape. The rising sun cast long shadows behind them, and Willa stood watching until they disappeared from sight. The days that followed were busy ones in Willowcreek. The town buried Sheriff Davis with full honors, and the general store slowly returned to normal operation. Willa threw herself into her work, helping Mr. Peterson restock shelves and serve customers, but her thoughts often drifted to Thomas and his posse, wondering where they were and if they were safe. On the 5th day after their departure, a stranger rode into town. He was an older man, his salt and pepper hair visible beneath a well-worn hat, his movements those of someone accustomed to authority. He tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and went inside. Curious, Willa watched from the store window. "Who do you suppose that is?" Mr. Peterson asked, coming to stand beside her. "I'm not sure," Willa replied, though she had a suspicion. Her guess was confirmed an hour later when Mayor Harrington entered the store, the stranger at his side. "Miss Lockhart." "Mr. Peterson," the mayor said jovially, "may I introduce our new sheriff, Samuel Turner. He's come all the way from Texas at Marshal Vance's recommendation." Samuel Turner tipped his hat to them both. "Pleased to meet you folks. Sorry about the circumstances." "We're very glad to have you, Sheriff Turner," Mr. Peterson said warmly. "Can we help you with anything?" "Just getting to know the town and its people," Turner replied. Marshal Vance spoke highly of this establishment. His eyes rested briefly on Willa. "And its employees." Willa felt her cheeks warm slightly. "You've heard from the marshal, then?" Sheriff Turner nodded. "Got a telegram this morning. He and his men caught up with 2 more of the Clayton gang yesterday near Bear Creek. Unfortunately, Jim Clayton and his brother are still at large." "Are they all right?" "The marshal and his men?" Willa asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Foster took another bullet, but he'll live. The others are fine. They should be back in town tomorrow or the day after." Sheriff Turner studied her for a moment, a knowing look in his weathered face. "Marshal Vance is too stubborn to get himself killed, Miss Lockhart. I've known him 10 years, and he's survived worse than Jim Clayton." After the sheriff and mayor left, Mr. Peterson gave Willa a thoughtful look. "You seem quite concerned about the marshal, my dear." Willa busied herself with straightening a display of canned peaches. "He saved my life during the robbery. It's only natural I'd be concerned." Mr. Peterson made a non-committal sound but said nothing more. Willa was grateful for his discretion. She hardly understood her own feelings, let alone wanted to discuss them with her kindly employer. That night, Willa found sleep elusive. She lay awake, listening to the occasional sounds from the street below, a dog barking, the distant piano from the saloon, a late-night rider passing through. Her thoughts circled back to Thomas Vance. Was he camping under the stars tonight, still pursuing the remaining outlaws? Was he wounded but too proud to mention it in his telegram? Or was he already on his way back to Willowcreek? And why did she care so much about a man she barely knew? The answer came to her unbidden, because in her darkest moment, when she had been hiding in fear as the lamps burned out, he had struck a match and smiled, bringing light back into her world. It was as simple and as complicated as that. 2 more days passed with no sign of Thomas and his posse. Sheriff Turner settled into his new role efficiently, bringing a sense of calm back to Willowcreek. Willa found herself seeking out the sheriff each day, hoping for news, but he had heard nothing further from the marshal. On the evening of the 8th day since Thomas's departure, Willa was working late at the store, helping Mr. Peterson prepare an order for the following day. The bell above the door jingled, and she looked up to see Deputy Foster enter, his arm still in a sling, but otherwise looking well. "Evening, Miss Lockhart, Mr. Peterson," he greeted them. "Thought you'd want to know the marshal and the boys are back. Got in about an hour ago." Willa's heart leaped. Were they successful? Foster's expression darkened. "Caught 2 more of the gang, but Clayton and his brother slipped away. Crossed into Montana territory." He shook his head. "Marshal Vance isn't happy about it." "Is he—" Willa hesitated. "Is he all right?" Tired and in a foul mood, but unharmed, Foster replied with a small smile. He's at the hotel now, cleaning up before heading to the saloon. Said something about needing a drink and a decent meal. Mr. Peterson looked at the clock on the wall. It's nearly closing time anyway, Willa. Why don't you finish up for the night? I can complete the order in the morning. Willa hesitated, torn between propriety and her desire to see Thomas. A proper young lady wouldn't seek out a man at a saloon. But then, proper young ladies didn't typically work in general stores in frontier towns either. Thank you, Mr. Peterson. I think I will call it a night. After closing the store, Willa walked slowly toward her boarding house, but her feet seemed to have other ideas. Almost against her will, she found herself passing the hotel and continuing down the street toward the Golden Eagle Saloon. She paused outside, hearing the piano music and men's laughter spilling out into the night. What was she doing? She couldn't simply walk into a saloon looking for Thomas. It wouldn't be proper. She was about to turn away when the Batwing doors swung open and Sheriff Turner stepped out, nearly colliding with her. "Miss Lockhart," he said in surprise. "Didn't expect to find you out at this hour." "I was just on my way home," she said quickly. "From the store." The sheriff's eyes twinkled knowingly. "The store's in the other direction, isn't it?" Willa flushed, grateful for the darkness. I heard the marshal had returned. I wanted to thank him for bringing justice to our town." Turner smiled. "He's inside, having his first hot meal in days. I'm sure he'd appreciate your thanks." He held the door open for her. "I'll escort you in, if you'd like." Propriety warred with desire in Willa's mind. "I couldn't possibly." "There's a small dining area separate from the bar," Turner assured her. "Quite respectable. Several ladies from town eat there regularly." Before she could change her mind, Willa nodded and allowed Sheriff Turner to guide her through the Batwing doors. The saloon was busy, but not rowdy, with several tables occupied by miners and cowboys. A few glances came her way, but most returned to their drinks when they saw her with the sheriff. Thomas sat alone at a table in the corner of the dining area, a plate of food and a glass of whiskey before him. He looked up as they approached, surprise and something else. Pleasure? Crossing his face when he saw Willa. "Marshal," Sheriff Turner said with a smile, "found someone outside who wanted to thank you properly for your service to Willowcreek." Thomas stood quickly. "Miss Lockhart, this is unexpected." "I'll leave you two to talk," Turner said, touching his hat before returning to the bar. Thomas gestured to the chair across from him. "Would you join me? I was just eating." Willa sat down, suddenly nervous. "I heard you'd returned. Deputy Foster said you caught more of the gang." Thomas nodded, his expression hardening slightly. "4 in custody now, 2 dead, but Jim Clayton and his brother Matt are still out there." He took a sip of his whiskey. "I'm sorry I couldn't bring them all to justice." "You've done more than anyone could expect," Willa said gently. "The town feels safe again, thanks to you." He studied her face for a moment. "You look well. I'm glad the events of that day haven't left too deep a mark on you." "They have," she admitted, "but not all marks are visible." She glanced around the saloon, then back to him. "How long will you stay in Willowcreek now?" Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "A few days at most. I need to file my report, then head to Helena. That's where the Clayton brothers were last seen." Disappointment settled in Willa's chest, though she tried not to show it. "Of course! You must go where duty calls." A barmaid approached, asking if Willa wanted anything. She ordered a cup of tea, ignoring the woman's raised eyebrow at finding a respectable young woman in the saloon. After the barmaid left, Thomas leaned forward. "You surprised me tonight, Willa. I wouldn't have expected to see you here." "I surprised myself," she confessed with a small smile. "But I wanted to see you before you left again. To thank you properly." "For what?" "For that night in the store, when you struck that match in the darkness." She met his eyes directly. "I was so afraid. And then suddenly, there you were. It meant more than I can say." Thomas's expression softened. "I remember. You looked like a cornered doe, ready to bolt. But brave, too. Not many women would have stayed as calm as you did with a derringer in their hand." Their conversation flowed easily after that. Thomas told her about his journey tracking the outlaws. The cold nights under the stars, the tension of the final confrontation. Willa shared stories of Willowcreek slowly returning to normal, the arrival of Sheriff Turner, and her own quiet evenings reading by lamplight in her room above the milliner's shop. By the time Willa finished her tea, she knew she had stayed far longer than propriety allowed. "I should go," she said reluctantly. "It's getting late." Thomas nodded, rising with her. "I'll walk you home." Outside, the night had grown cooler, and Willa wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. They walked in companionable silence for a few minutes, their footsteps echoing on the wooden sidewalk. "Thank you for coming to find me tonight," Thomas said finally. "It was a bright spot in an otherwise difficult day." Willa glanced up at him. "Do you ever get tired of it? The constant pursuit of men like Clayton?" He was quiet for so long that Willa thought he might not answer. Then he sighed. "Sometimes. There are days when I wonder what it might be like to have a normal life, a home, a family." He looked down at her. "But then I remember why I do what I do. Someone has to stand between people like Clayton and folks just trying to live their lives in peace." "That's a heavy burden to carry alone," Willa observed softly. Thomas smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Most burdens are lighter when shared, but my line of work doesn't lend itself to sharing. It's not fair to ask someone to wait at home, never knowing if I'll return." They had reached her boarding house, and Willa turned to face him. Perhaps the person waiting would consider it worth the uncertainty. Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, hope, perhaps, quickly extinguished by caution. "Willa, I'm not proposing anything, Marshal Vance," she said with a smile, "merely making an observation." He chuckled, the tension breaking. "Of course, my mistake." In the dim light from a nearby window, Willa could see the lines of exhaustion on his face, the weight of responsibility in his stance. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm lightly. "Get some rest, Thomas. Even marshals need sleep." He covered her hand with his for a brief moment. "Good night, Willa. Thank you again for the company." As she climbed the stairs to her room, Willa's heart felt lighter than it had in days. Thomas Vance was still a mystery to her in many ways. But she was beginning to understand him better. And what she understood, she admired his sense of duty, his quiet strength, the way he carried his burdens without complaint. What she didn't understand was why the thought of him leaving again caused such an ache in her chest. The following day, Willa was arranging a display of fabric when Sheriff Turner entered the general store. He removed his hat as he approached the counter. "Morning, Miss Lockhart. I wonder if I might have a word." "Of course, Sheriff. How can I help you?" Turner glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "It's about Marshal Vance. He received a telegram this morning from the federal marshal's office in Denver. They want him to report in person about the Clayton case." Willa felt a pang of disappointment. "So he'll be leaving sooner than expected?" "That's just it," Turner said, leaning against the counter. "He's thinking of refusing the order. Says he needs to keep tracking the Claytons while the trail is fresh." "I don't understand. Why are you telling me this?" The sheriff's expression was serious. "Because he's liable to get himself fired if he disobeys a direct order. And between you and me, Miss Lockhart, I think Thomas Vance needs this badge more than it needs him. Gives him purpose." "What do you expect me to do about it?" "Talk to him," Turner suggested. "He might listen to you. He respects you." Willa shook her head. "Sheriff, I barely know the marshal. Why would he listen to me over his own judgment?" Turner smiled knowingly. "I saw the way he looked at you last night in the saloon, and I know Thomas better than most. He doesn't let many people get close, but when he does, he values their opinion." He put his hat back on. "He's at the telegraph office now, if you're interested." After the sheriff left, Willa stood in indecision. It wasn't her place to interfere in Thomas's professional decisions. Yet, if Sheriff Turner was right, and Thomas was about to jeopardize his career. Making up her mind, she removed her apron and called to Mr. Peterson that she was stepping out for a moment. The telegraph office was just a few doors down, and she found Thomas inside, writing something on a telegram form. He looked up as she entered, surprise evident on his face. "Willa, what brings you here?" "Sheriff Turner mentioned you'd received orders from Denver," she said, dispensing with pleasantries. Thomas's expression hardened slightly. "Turner should mind his own business." "He's concerned, Thomas, as am I." He set down his pencil. "There's no need for concern. I'm doing my job as I see fit. By disobeying a direct order? Willa challenged. Thomas sighed, rubbing his forehead. The men in Denver don't understand. If I let the trail go cold, the Claytons could disappear. They could hurt more people. And if you lose your badge? Willa asked softly. How will you help anyone then? He had no immediate response to that. They stood in silence for a moment, the telegraph operator pointedly busying himself with some papers on his desk. Walk with me? Thomas finally suggested, gesturing toward the door. Outside, they strolled slowly down the sidewalk, neither speaking until they reached a small bench outside the town's modest schoolhouse, currently empty for the summer. When I was 16, Thomas began abruptly, outlaws killed my father. He was a storekeeper, like your Mr. Peterson. Refused to pay protection money to a local gang. His voice was steady but distant, as if telling someone else's story. I watched him die on the floor of his own store. The local sheriff did nothing. He was in the gang's pocket. Willa's heart ached for the boy he had been. I'm sorry, Thomas. That's why I became a lawman, to stand for those who can't stand for themselves. He looked at her directly. Jim Clayton has killed 11 people that I know of. If I go to Denver now, he'll kill more. And if you lose your badge, he'll still kill more, Willa countered gently. But you won't be able to stop him. She hesitated, then placed her hand over his. Sometimes, to win the war, you must retreat from a battle. Thomas stared at their hands for a long moment, then closed his eyes. You sound like my father. He always said patience was more powerful than rage. He sounds like a wise man. He was. Thomas opened his eyes, a decision evident in them. I'll go to Denver, but I'll be back on Clayton's trail as soon as I can. Willa squeezed his hand once before withdrawing her own. When do you leave? Tomorrow morning's stage. He studied her face as if memorizing it. I'll be gone at least 2 weeks. 2 weeks. It wasn't so very long, Willa told herself, ignoring the hollow feeling in her chest. Willowcreek will still be here when you return, she said lightly, with considerably fewer outlaws, thanks to you. Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him that day. And will you still be here, Willa Lockhart? The question hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond the simple words. Willa met his gaze steadily. I have no plans to leave Willowcreek. It's become home to me. Something in his expression eased. I'm glad to hear it. He stood, offering her his hand to help her up. I should finish that telegram, and you probably need to get back to the store. As they walked back toward the telegraph office, their hands brushed occasionally, neither of them pulling away. It was a small thing, but to Willa it felt significant in acknowledgement of whatever was growing between them, fragile but persistent. That evening, Mr. Peterson insisted on hosting a small dinner for Thomas at his home, inviting Willa, Sheriff Turner, and Deputy Foster to join them. It was a pleasant gathering, with good food and better conversation. As the evening progressed, Willa found herself watching Thomas interact with the others, noting how he relaxed among friends, how his smile came more easily, how the lines of tension in his face softened. When it came time to leave, Thomas offered to walk Willa home again. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. Thank you for convincing me to follow orders, Thomas said as they walked. You were right. I wasn't thinking clearly. You were thinking with your heart, Willa replied. It's not always a bad thing. In my line of work, it can be dangerous. They reached her boarding house too quickly. Willa hesitated on the bottom step, reluctant for their evening to end. Will you write to me from Denver? She asked impulsively. Thomas looked surprised, then pleased. If you'd like me to? I would. She gathered her courage. I'd like to know how you are, what you're doing, if you're safe. He stepped closer, his expression serious in the moonlight. Why does it matter to you, Willa? My safety? The directness of the question took her breath away. Because, she faltered, then continued more firmly. Because when those lamps burned out in the store that night, I thought I might die alone in the darkness. And then you came with your match and your smile, and suddenly there was light again. She met his eyes. You brought light back into my world, Thomas. I don't want to see it extinguished. Thomas reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she wished, and touched her cheek with gentle fingers. No one has ever spoken to me like that before. Willa leaned slightly into his touch. Perhaps no one has seen you clearly before. His hand moved to cradle the back of her head, and he leaned down, hesitating just before their lips met, a question in his eyes. Willa answered by closing the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a soft, sweet kiss that sent warmth cascading through her entire body. When they parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers for a moment. "I'll write," he promised, "and I'll come back." "I know you will," she whispered. She watched him walk away, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the night. Tomorrow he would leave on the stage, and who knew what dangers awaited him in the weeks to come. But tonight, under a starlit Wyoming sky, Willa Lockhart had found something she hadn't realized. She was searching for a connection that transcended the brief time they had known each other, a feeling that felt remarkably like coming home. The first letter arrived 5 days after Thomas left for Denver. Willa recognized his handwriting immediately strong and decisive, much like the man himself. She waited until evening to open it, savoring the anticipation as she sat by the window in her small room, the lamp burning low. "Dear Willa," she read, "Denver is, as I remembered it, growing too quickly for its own good, full of opportunists and dreamers alike. The federal marshal's office was displeased with my decision to let the Claytons escape into Montana, but after reviewing my full report, they've agreed to let me continue the pursuit once matters here are settled. I find myself thinking of Willowcreek often, though I've only spent a short time there. Perhaps it's not the town that occupies my thoughts, but rather a certain shopkeeper with honey blonde hair and more courage than she knows." The letter continued, describing his meetings with various officials, his frustration with bureaucracy, and his determination to return to the trail as soon as possible. He ended with, "I hope this finds you well and safe, until I return, Thomas." Willa pressed the letter to her heart, a smile playing on her lips. It wasn't a love letter by any conventional standard, but she could read between the lines his loneliness in the city, his thoughts of her, his promise to return. She wrote back that same night, telling him of the everyday happenings in Willowcreek, how Sheriff Turner had already gained the town's respect, how Mr. Peterson was considering expanding the general store, how she had begun teaching reading to a group of children whose families couldn't afford the school fees. Their correspondence continued over the next 2 weeks. Thomas's letters became gradually more personal, sharing memories of his childhood in Kansas, his early days as a lawman, his dreams of someday settling down when the territories were safer. Willa, in turn, told him about growing up in Missouri, losing her mother to consumption when she was 12, caring for her father until his heart gave out 3 years ago, and her decision to head west for a fresh start. In his 5th letter, Thomas wrote, "I've been authorized to return to the field. By the time you receive this, I will be on my way to Helena to pick up the Claytons' trail. I cannot say when I will return to Willowcreek, but know that I carry thoughts of you with me. Your letters have been a light in these tedious weeks, reminding me that there is more to life than the pursuit of justice. Be well, Willa. Look for me when the summer ends." When the summer ends. Willa read those words over and over. It was already late July. Summer in Wyoming territory was brief, giving way to autumn by early September. Would it be a month before she saw him again? 2? Or longer, if the Claytons proved elusive. Life in Willowcreek continued its steady pace. Willa threw herself into her work at the store and her evening reading classes. She made friends with the new school teacher, a young woman named Elizabeth Hayes who had arrived from Chicago to take up the position. The two often took Sunday walks together, discussing books and sharing confidences. "You seem distracted lately," Elizabeth observed one warm August afternoon as they strolled by the creek that gave the town its name. "Is everything all right?" Willa hesitated, then decided to confide in her friend. "I've been corresponding with Marshal Vance." Elizabeth's eyes widened. "The handsome marshal who caught those outlaws? The one Sheriff Turner is always talking about?" "Yes," Willa admitted with a small smile. "He's in Montana now, tracking the last of the gang." "And you care for him?" Elizabeth stated, rather than asked. Willa nodded, watching the play of sunlight on the water. "It's strange, isn't it? We've spent so little time together. Yet I feel as if I've known him for years." The heart has its own timetable, Elizabeth said wisely. My mother always said you could know someone for decades and feel nothing, or meet a person for 5 minutes and know they'll change your life forever. But his life is so different from mine, Willa sighed. He rides from town to town, always in danger, and You what? Wish for a quiet life? Safety? Elizabeth challenged gently. If that were true, you wouldn't have left Missouri for the Wyoming Territory. Willa laughed softly. You're too perceptive, Elizabeth. You're right, of course. I came west seeking something, adventure perhaps, or purpose. And have you found it? The question gave Willa pause. Had she found what she was looking for? Willowcreek had become home. With its small community and breathtaking surroundings. She had meaningful work, both at the store and with her reading classes. She had made friends, yet there was still a restlessness in her, a feeling that there was more waiting just beyond the horizon. I'm not sure, she answered honestly, but I think I might be closer now than I was before. As August gave way to September, Willa found herself watching for riders coming into town, hoping each might be Thomas. His letters had stopped, which she told herself was to be expected. He was on the trail after all, far from regular post offices. Still, the silence weighed on her. Sheriff Turner kept her informed of what little news reached him. Last I heard, he'd tracked the Claytons to a mining camp near Virginia City, he told her one day when she stopped by his office. That was 2 weeks ago, and nothing since? Willa tried to keep the worry from her voice. Turner shook his head. Thomas is thorough. He won't rush this, not after tracking them so long. He gave her a reassuring smile. Don't worry, Miss Lockhart. He's hard to kill. But worry she did, especially as September progressed and the nights grew colder. The aspens in the surrounding mountains turned golden, then began to shed their leaves. Still no word from Thomas. On the last day of September, as Willa was closing the store for the night, she heard a commotion outside. Looking through the window, she saw a group of riders coming down the main street. Her heart leaped, then fell as she realized none of them was Thomas. Instead, it was a cattle drive passing through. Cowboys herding their stock toward the railroad station 10 miles south. She locked the door and began her walk home, pulling her shawl tightly around her shoulders against the evening chill. The saloon was busy with the newly arrived cowboys, piano music and laughter spilling out into the street. Willa kept her head down, not wanting to catch the eye of any rowdy cattlemen looking for company. Miss Lockhart, a voice called from behind her. She turned to see Sheriff Turner approaching rapidly. Sheriff, is something wrong? Just received a telegram, he said, slightly out of breath. Thought you'd want to know right away. Thomas captured Jim Clayton yesterday near Helena. Joy surged through Willa. He's all right then? Turner's expression grew more serious. The telegram didn't say much. Just that Clayton's in custody and Thomas was bringing him in personally. He hesitated. There was mention of injuries, but no details. Injuries? Willa's joy turned to concern. To the marshal? Can't say for sure, Turner admitted. But the telegram was from Thomas himself, so he's alive and able to send messages, which is a good sign. Willa nodded, trying to take comfort in that fact. When will they arrive? Hard to say. Depends on how they're traveling and Clayton's condition. Could be a few days, could be a week. The sheriff touched her arm briefly. I'll let you know as soon as I hear more. That night, Willa slept poorly, her dreams filled with shadowy gunfights and Thomas lying wounded in some remote Montana wilderness. She woke before dawn, her heart racing, and knew further sleep was impossible. She dressed and went downstairs, letting herself out of the boarding house quietly. The town was still dark, most of its inhabitants still abed. Willa walked without any particular destination, eventually finding herself at the small church on the edge of town. The door was unlocked, as always, and she slipped inside, taking a seat in one of the back pews. She wasn't particularly religious, but there was something comforting about the quiet sanctuary. Shafts of early morning light began to filter through the windows as the sun rose, illuminating the simple altar with its wooden cross. Willa closed her eyes and offered up a silent prayer for Thomas's safe return. Thought I might find you here, a familiar voice said softly. Willa's eyes flew open. Sheriff Turner stood in the aisle, his expression grave. "What is it?" she asked, her throat suddenly tight. "Is it Thomas?" Turner nodded. "Just got another telegram. They'll be here by nightfall." "Thank God," Willa breathed. "And his injuries?" "The telegram didn't specify," Turner said, "but he's well enough to travel, which is something." The day passed with excruciating slowness for Willa. She went through her duties at the store mechanically, making mistakes that Mr. Peterson kindly overlooked. By late afternoon, she could bear it no longer and asked to leave early. "Of course, my dear," Mr. Peterson said sympathetically. "I understand you're concerned about the marshal. Go on now." Willa went home to change, donning her best dress, a deep blue cotton with white lace at the collar and cuffs. She brushed her hair until it shone, then pinned it up neatly. Looking in her small mirror, she pinched her pale cheeks for color and bit her lips to redden them. "Don't be a fool, Willa," she murmured to her reflection. "He may not even notice." But she wanted to look her best for him, regardless. As the sun began to set, Willa made her way to the sheriff's office, where a small crowd had already gathered. Word of Marshal Vance's imminent arrival with the notorious Jim Clayton had spread through town quickly. Mayor Harrington was there, along with several town council members and curious citizens. Sheriff Turner nodded to Willa as she joined the waiting group. "Should be any time now," he said. The minutes ticked by. Darkness fell, and someone lit the street lamps. The crowd grew restless, some drifting away to homes and saloons. Willa remained, her hands clasped tightly before her, eyes fixed on the northern road leading into town, and then, finally, the sound of hoofbeats. 3 riders appeared at the edge of town, moving slowly. As they drew closer, Willa could make out a large man with his hands bound, flanked by 2 others. Thomas rode on the left, his posture straight, despite what must have been exhaustion. Even in the dim light, Willa could see that his face was bruised, a dark patch visible on his left cheek. The right sleeve of his coat appeared torn and stained with something that might have been blood. The other rider was unfamiliar to Willa, probably a deputy from Helena helping with the prisoner transport. Between them rode Jim Clayton, a bear of a man with wild hair and a thick beard, his hands shackled before him. The small procession stopped in front of the sheriff's office. Turner stepped forward to greet them, helping the Helena deputy secure Clayton as he dismounted. Thomas remained on his horse for a moment longer, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found Willa. Even at a distance, she could see his face soften as their gazes met. He dismounted slowly, grimacing slightly as his boots hit the ground. Turner and the deputy led Clayton inside, while the crowd pressed closer, eager to get a look at the infamous outlaw. Thomas made his way through them toward Willa, removing his hat as he approached. "Willa," he said simply, his voice rough with fatigue. "Thomas," she replied, drinking in the sight of him. Up close, she could see the extent of his injuries, a healing cut above his right eyebrow, a dark bruise on his left cheekbone, and the way he held his right arm carefully, as if it pained him. "You're hurt." He shrugged, then winced at the movement. "Nothing serious. Clayton didn't surrender easily. But you caught him." A satisfied smile crossed Thomas's face. "Yes. After 3 months and too many miles to count, I finally caught him." The smile faded as he swayed slightly on his feet. "I need to see to the prisoner." Willa reached out to steady him. "You need to see a doctor. The sheriff can handle Clayton." Thomas opened his mouth to protest, but Sheriff Turner emerged from his office just then. "Marshal, get yourself to Doc Wilson. That's an order. I've got Clayton secured, and Deputy Mills from Helena is helping stand guard." Thomas hesitated, then nodded, his exhaustion evident. "All right, but I want to be notified if there's any trouble." "Of course," Turner agreed readily. "Now, go get patched up before you fall over." Willa kept her hand on Thomas's arm. "I'll help you to the doctor's." They walked slowly through town, Thomas leaning on Willa more than he probably wanted to admit. The doctor's house was near the church, a small white building with a sign proclaiming J. Wilson, physician and surgeon, hanging by the door. Dr. Wilson, a middle-aged man with spectacles and a kind face, answered their knock promptly. "Marshal Vance, I presume. Sheriff Turner sent word you might be needing my services. Come in, come in." Willa helped Thomas to a chair in the doctor's examination room, then stepped back as Dr. Wilson began his assessment. "I'll wait outside," she said. Thomas caught her hand. "Stay, if you don't mind?" She nodded. Moving to a corner of the room, as the doctor helped Thomas remove his coat and shirt, Willa tried not to stare at his bare torso, but couldn't help noticing the lean muscle beneath his tan skin and the array of old scars that told the story of a dangerous life. A fresh wound on his right shoulder had been hastily bandaged, the cloth stained with dried blood. "Bullet?" Dr. Wilson asked professionally, removing the bandage. Thomas nodded. "Grazed me during the arrest. A deputy in Helena patched it up 3 days ago." Not a bad job, but it could use cleaning and fresh dressing." The doctor set to work, cleaning the wound with carbolic solution and applying a new bandage. He also examined Thomas's other injuries, the cut above his eyebrow, bruised ribs, and various scrapes and contusions. "You've been in quite a fight, Marshal. Like I said, Clayton didn't surrender easily." Thomas winced as the doctor prodded a particularly tender spot on his side. "Well, nothing's broken at least. That shoulder wound will heal cleanly if you keep it clean and give it rest." Dr. Wilson stepped back. "And by rest, I mean actual rest, Marshal. No chasing outlaws for at least a week." Thomas smiled wryly. "No need. I've caught the one I was after." After the examination, with Thomas redressed in a clean shirt the doctor provided, they stepped back out into the night. The air had grown cooler, stars bright in the clear sky above. "I should get back to the sheriff's office," Thomas said, though he made no move to leave Willa's side. "You heard the doctor? You need rest." Willa hesitated, then added, "Come with me. I have something for you." Curiosity won out over duty, and Thomas followed her to her boarding house. "Wait here," she instructed, leaving him on the porch while she went inside. She returned moments later with a small package wrapped in brown paper, similar to the one she had given him before he left to track the Claytons. "What's this?" he asked, accepting it. "Open it," she urged. Thomas unwrapped the package to find a leather-bound journal, its cover tooled with a simple geometric pattern. "Willa, I noticed you keeping notes in that tattered little book you carry," she explained. "I thought you might like something more durable. I asked Mr. Peterson to order it, specially from Denver." Thomas ran his fingers over the smooth leather. "It's beautiful. Thank you." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. The sounds of the night surrounding them, crickets chirping, a distant piano from the saloon, the soft rustle of wind through the aspens. "I missed you," Thomas said abruptly, his eyes meeting hers. "More than I expected to. More than I should have, perhaps." Willa's heart quickened. "I missed you too." He stepped closer, still holding the journal in one hand. "When I was tracking Clayton, I kept thinking about what I'd say when I saw you again. I had it all planned out." He smiled ruefully. "Now, I can't remember a word of it." "You don't need to say anything," Willa told him softly. Thomas touched her cheek, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I do, because I've never met anyone like you, Willa Lockhart, and I need you to know that, whatever happens next, whatever path my duty takes me down, I will always find my way back to you." Willa raised her hand to cover his. "I'll be waiting." He leaned down and kissed her, his lips warm and firm against hers. Unlike their first kiss, this one carried the weight of separation and reunion, of the dangers faced and overcome. Willa wound her arms around his neck, being careful of his injured shoulder, and returned the kiss with all the emotion she had held inside during the long weeks of his absence. When they finally parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I should go. It's late, and you have your reputation to consider." Willa smiled. "My reputation can withstand a kiss on the porch, I think." "Even so?" He straightened, reluctance evident in his movements. "I need to check on Clayton and get some rest. Doctor's orders." "Will I see you tomorrow?" she asked. "Count on it," he promised. "I need to file my final report, and then—" He hesitated. "And then we need to talk about what comes next." What comes next? The words held both promise and uncertainty. Willa nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Thomas kissed her once more, briefly but tenderly, before stepping back. "Good night, Willa." She watched him walk away, his tall figure silhouetted against the night sky, and felt a strange mixture of joy and apprehension. He had returned to her, as he promised. But what would come next for a U.S. Marshal who had just captured his most wanted outlaw? And what place could she have in whatever future awaited him? The next morning dawned clear and cool, the first real hint of autumn in the air. Willa dressed with particular care, selecting a green dress that Thomas had once complimented in passing. At the store, Mr. Peterson noticed her improved spirits immediately. "I take it the Marshal returned safely?" he asked with a knowing smile. "Yes," Willa confirmed, unable to keep the happiness from her voice. "He brought in Jim Clayton last night." "Quite an accomplishment," Mr. Peterson said appreciatively. "The whole town's talking about it. Clayton's gang has been terrorizing the territories for years." Throughout the morning, customers came and went, many discussing the capture of the notorious outlaw. Willa learned that Clayton would be taken to Cheyenne the following day to stand trial for multiple murders and robberies. What she didn't hear was any news of Thomas. Shortly after noon, the bell above the door jingled, and Sheriff Turner entered the store. Willa looked up eagerly, but the sheriff was alone. "Afternoon, Miss Lockhart," he greeted her. "I was wondering if you'd seen Marshal Vance today." Willa's heart sank. "No, I haven't. Isn't he at your office?" Turner shook his head. "He was there early this morning, filing his report. Said he had some business to attend to, but didn't elaborate. I assumed he might have come to see you." "No," Willa said, trying to mask her disappointment. "Perhaps he's resting at the hotel? The doctor did say he needed it." "Perhaps," Turner agreed, though he didn't sound convinced. "If you see him, tell him I need to discuss the prisoner transfer arrangements for tomorrow." After the sheriff left, Willa found it difficult to concentrate on her work. Where was Thomas? Had he left town without saying goodbye? No, she refused to believe that, not after his words last night. By closing time, there was still no sign of him. Willa locked up the store and headed home, her earlier happiness giving way to confusion and hurt. Had she misunderstood his intentions? Had the kiss meant less to him than it had to her? As she approached her boarding house, she saw a figure sitting on the porch steps. Thomas, his hat in his hands, waiting for her. Relief flooded through her. "Thomas, I was worried when Sheriff Turner said he hadn't seen you." He stood as she approached, a strange nervousness about him that she hadn't seen before. "I'm sorry, I had something important to do today." "More important than resting, as the doctor ordered?" she teased gently. "Yes," he said seriously. "Much more important." There was something different about him, Willa realized. He was freshly shaved, his hair neatly trimmed. He wore a clean white shirt beneath a new black vest, and his usual worn coat had been replaced by one of better quality. But it was his expression that truly caught her attention, a mixture of determination and vulnerability that made her breath catch. "Thomas, what is it?" He took her hand, leading her to sit beside him on the steps. "I've been thinking about what I said last night, about finding my way back to you." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "The truth is, Willa, I don't want to keep leaving and coming back. I want to stay." Her heart began to race. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that this morning I sent a telegram to Denver. I've resigned my position as U.S. Marshal." Willa stared at him in shock. "But your duty, catching outlaws like Clayton." "It's who you are." Thomas shook his head. "It's what I've done, not who I am." He took both her hands in his. "I became a marshal to make a difference, to protect people from men like Clayton, and I believe I have. But there comes a time when a man has to decide what kind of life he wants to live." His eyes held hers steadily. "I want a life with purpose, yes, but also with peace, with connection, with love." Willa could barely breathe. "And you think you can find those things here, in Willowcreek?" "I think I already have." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "I spent the day making arrangements. I've spoken with Mayor Harrington and the town council. With Clayton captured, they're concerned about maintaining law and order. They've offered me the position of sheriff when Turner returns to Texas next month." "Sheriff of Willowcreek," Willa repeated, trying to absorb the implications. Thomas would be staying, here, permanently. "It's a good position," he continued. "Steady, respectable." He hesitated, then opened the box, revealing a simple gold ring set with a small pearl. "Respectable enough, I hope, for a man to ask a woman to share his life." Willa's eyes filled with tears. Thomas. I know it's sudden, he said quickly. We've known each other only a short time. If you need time to consider— No, she interrupted, placing her fingers gently against his lips. I don't need time. I know what I want. She smiled through her tears. I want you, Thomas Vance. I have since the moment you struck that match in the darkness and showed me your smile. Relief and joy transformed his face. Then, Willa Lockhart, will you marry me? Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, a kiss full of promise and future and home. When they parted, Willa rested her head against his shoulder, mindful of his injury. What made you decide? To give up being a marshal, I mean. Thomas was quiet for a moment. When I finally captured Clayton after all those months of pursuit, I expected to feel, I don't know, vindicated, triumphant. He sighed. Instead, all I felt was tired, and I realized that I'd spent years chasing men like him, bringing them to justice, only to have new outlaws take their place. It's necessary work, but it's endless. And now, Willa asked softly, now I want to build something, not just tear down the bad. His arm tightened around her. A life, a home, a family someday. With you. They sat together as twilight deepened into night, planning their future. Thomas had already spoken with Reverend Collins about performing the ceremony. They would marry in 2 weeks' time, after the banns had been read. In the meantime, Thomas would assist Sheriff Turner until Clayton's transfer to Cheyenne, then begin learning the particular challenges of keeping peace in a growing frontier town. It won't always be easy, Thomas warned her. I've made enemies over the years, and while Willowcreek is peaceful compared to some places, it has its share of trouble. I'm not afraid, Willa assured him. Not anymore. Later that night, after Thomas had reluctantly left her at her door with a lingering kiss, Willa stood by her window, looking out at the star-filled sky. She thought about the strange paths that had led them both to this moment, her journey west after her father's death. Thomas's years as a marshal, the terrible day when outlaws had terrorized Willowcreek. If the Clayton gang hadn't chosen their town, if Thomas hadn't been assigned to track them, if she hadn't been hiding in that store when the lamps burned out. So many chance events that had somehow aligned to bring them together. She touched the ring on her finger, still marveling at the swiftness with which her life had changed. Yet it didn't feel rushed or impulsive. It felt right, as if she had been waiting all along for Thomas Vance to strike a match in the darkness and light her way home. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparations and congratulations. Word of their engagement spread quickly through Willowcreek, and Willa found herself the recipient of good wishes and curious questions from townspeople who had previously paid her little mind. Elizabeth, her teacher friend, was delighted with the news. I told you the heart has its own timetable, she reminded Willa as they selected fabric for a wedding dress. And I must say, you've chosen well. Marshal Vance, or should I say, our future Sheriff Vance, is quite the catch. Mr. Peterson insisted on hosting their wedding reception at his home. You're like a daughter to me, Willa, he said, patting her hand affectionately. Let me do this for you. Thomas, meanwhile, threw himself into his new role with characteristic dedication. He spent long hours with Sheriff Turner, learning the particulars of Willowcreek's citizens, its trouble spots, and its needs. He also secured a small house on the edge of town, nothing fancy but solidly built, with 2 bedrooms and a view of the distant mountains. It needs some work, he admitted when he showed it to Willa for the first time, but I thought it had potential. Willa walked through the empty rooms, imagining them filled with furniture, with warmth, with life. It's perfect, she told him sincerely. It's ours. The day of Clayton's transfer to Cheyenne came and went without incident. Thomas and Sheriff Turner personally escorted the outlaw to the railroad station, where federal marshals took him into custody for the journey to Cheyenne and his eventual trial. When Thomas returned, there was a new lightness about him, as if a chapter had finally closed. It's done, he told Willa that evening, as they sat on the porch of their future home. Clayton will face justice for his crimes. And his brother? Willa asked. Is he still at large? For now, Thomas acknowledged. But he doesn't have his brother's cunning or connections. The authorities in Montana will catch him eventually. He took her hand. That's not my concern anymore. My concern is right here in Willowcreek. The wedding day dawned clear and cool, the aspens in the surrounding hills a blaze of gold and orange against the blue sky. Willa dressed in the simple but elegant gown she and Elizabeth had created, ivory silk with delicate lace at the bodice and sleeves. Elizabeth helped arrange her hair, weaving late-blooming wildflowers into the golden strands. "You look beautiful," her friend said, stepping back to admire her work. "Like something from a fairy tale." "I feel like I'm in one," Willa admitted. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is happening." "Believe it," Elizabeth said firmly. "You deserve happiness, Willa. You both do." The church was filled with townspeople, many of whom Willa barely knew, but who seemed genuinely happy to witness this union of the new sheriff and the general store clerk. Mayor Harrington sat in the front row, beaming with self-satisfaction, as if he had personally arranged the match. Sheriff Turner stood as Thomas's best man, while Elizabeth served as Willa's maid of honor. And then, Thomas was waiting for her at the altar, his eyes never leaving her as she walked down the aisle on Mr. Peterson's arm. He looked so handsome in his new suit, his expression a mixture of awe and adoration that made Willa's heart swell with love. Reverend Collins spoke of commitment and partnership, of building a life together through good times and bad. Willa and Thomas exchanged simple vows, and rings as a plain gold band that matched hers. And when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed her with such tenderness that tears sprang to her eyes. The reception at Mr. Peterson's home was a joyful affair, with food and music and dancing. Thomas surprised everyone, including Willa, by being a graceful dancer despite his imposing size. "Where did you learn to dance?" she asked, as he guided her expertly around the makeshift dance floor in Peterson's parlor. "My mother insisted," he replied with a smile. "Said no son of hers would stomp around like a buffalo, no matter how tall he got." As the celebration continued into the evening, Thomas and Willa slipped away quietly. Their house awaited them, furnished now with a mixture of new pieces and items gifted by townspeople, a sturdy table from Mayor Harrington, chairs from the saloon owner, linens from Elizabeth and other women of the town. Thomas carried Willa over the threshold, setting her down gently in what was now their home. Oil lamps burned low in the main room, casting a warm golden glow over their simple furnishings. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vance," he said softly. Willa reached up to touch his face, still marveling that this man was now her husband. "It feels right, doesn't it? Being here together. More right than anything has ever felt." He kissed her then, a kiss that held all the promise of their new beginning. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Thomas stroked Willa's hair gently. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed. "A home, a wife, a future that isn't just about the next criminal to track down." Willa nestled closer against him. "What do you see in that future now?" "Peace," he said simply. "Not just the absence of danger, but real peace, the kind that comes from building something worthwhile." He kissed the top of her head. "Children, someday if you want them. Growing old together, watching Willowcreek grow from a rough frontier town into a real community." "I want all of that," Willa assured him. "With you." As autumn gave way to winter, Thomas settled into his role as sheriff of Willowcreek. The town respected him from the start. His reputation as the man who caught Jim Clayton giving him an authority that few would challenge. Under his watchful eye, the saloons kept their rowdiness to a manageable level. Disputes between ranchers and farmers were settled peacefully, and travelers passed through town without incident. Willa continued working at the general store, though now as a full partner with Mr. Peterson rather than just a clerk. She also expanded her reading classes to include adults as well as children, teaching several miners and ranch hands who had never had the opportunity to learn. Their life together fell into comfortable rhythms. Mornings began with coffee at their kitchen table, planning their days. Evenings were spent reading by the fire or entertaining friends Elizabeth and her beau Robert, Sheriff Turner, before he returned to Texas. The new doctor and his wife, who arrived in November. The first test of their new life came in early December, when a fierce winter storm blew in from the north, trapping several travelers in town and cutting Willowcreek off from the outside world for nearly a week. Thomas organized shelter for the stranded visitors and led expeditions to check on outlying farms and ranches, returning each night exhausted but satisfied that everyone was safe. "This is what it means to be sheriff in a place like this," he told Willa, as she helped him remove his snow-covered boots after a particularly long day. "Not just keeping the peace, but keeping people alive." Christmas brought their first real celebration as a couple. They decorated their small home with pine boughs and candles, exchanged modest gifts, and hosted dinner for those in town with nowhere else to go, including 3 cowboys stranded by winter weather, Mr. Peterson, and Elizabeth, whose family remained in Chicago. As they prepared for bed that night, Thomas caught Willa's hand, pulling her gently into his arms. "Happy?" he asked, searching her face. "Completely," she assured him. "Are you? Do you ever miss the excitement of your Marshal days?" He considered the question seriously, as he did all things. "Sometimes I miss the clarity of it, knowing exactly what my purpose was each day. But then I look at what I have now at you, and I know I made the right choice." He kissed her softly. "This life we're building is worth more than any outlaw I could have caught." Spring arrived, melting the snow and bringing new growth to the hills around Willowcreek. The town began to expand as well, with new businesses opening and more settlers arriving each month. Thomas found himself busier than ever, though most of his work involved settling minor disputes rather than dealing with serious crime. One evening in late April, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Willa took Thomas's hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "I have news," she said softly. His eyes widened as he understood her meaning. "A baby? You're certain?" She nodded, her own joy reflected in his face. "Dr. Williams confirmed it today. We'll have a child by November, he thinks." Thomas gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious glass. "A family," he whispered against her hair. "We're going to be a family." The months of Willa's pregnancy passed with a mixture of anticipation and preparation. Thomas added a room to their house, working in the evenings and on his days off to create a nursery adjacent to their bedroom. Willa sewed tiny garments and blankets, daydreaming about the child growing within her. In mid-October, nearly a year since their wedding, Willa gave birth to a daughter. They named her Catherine, after Thomas's mother, though they called her Katie from the first moment. "She has your eyes," Thomas marveled, cradling the tiny infant in his large hands. "And your strength." "But your determination," Willa countered with a tired smile. 20 hours of labor, she wouldn't be rushed. As winter settled once more over Willowcreek, they established new rhythms to their life, now centered around Katie's needs. Thomas took to fatherhood with the same dedication he brought to everything, often walking the floor with the colicky infant so Willa could rest, or reading aloud to her from his reports, claiming it was never too early to learn about law enforcement. On a snowy evening in January, with Katie finally asleep in her cradle and the fire burning low in the hearth, Thomas and Willa sat together on their small sofa, her head resting against his shoulder. "Do you remember the night we met?" Willa asked softly. "In the general store, after the robbery?" "Of course," Thomas replied, his arm tightening around her. "You were terrified, but trying not to show it, holding that little derringer like it could actually stop a man." "I was hiding in the dark," she continued. "The lamps had all burned out. I thought I might die there, alone in the darkness." She tilted her face up to his. "And then you came and struck a match and smiled, and suddenly there was light again." Thomas kissed her forehead gently. "I remember thinking you were the bravest woman I'd ever seen, standing there in your dusty dress with your hair coming down, refusing to be cowed by what had happened." "I wasn't brave," Willa disagreed. "I was frozen with fear until you arrived." "That's what courage is," Thomas said, "being afraid but standing your ground anyway." He looked around their small, comfortable home, at the cradle where their daughter slept, at the life they had built together. "I never thought I'd have this, Willa, a place where I truly belong." "Nor did I," she admitted. "When my father died and I decided to come west, I was looking for something. I didn't know what, just something different from the emptiness I felt in Missouri." "And did you find it?" Thomas asked, echoing the question Elizabeth had posed to her all those months ago. Willa smiled, leaning up to kiss him softly. "I found you, And yes, that was exactly what I was looking for, even if I didn't know it. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Willowcreek in hushed white. Inside their small house, Thomas and Willa Vance sat before the dying fire, the future stretching before them like a path newly revealed in the light, a path they would walk together, step by step, day by day, into whatever adventures awaited them. For Willa, who had once waited in darkness as the lamps burned out, life now was full of light, the light that Thomas had brought when he struck that match and smiled. The light of their love for each other, and the new light that was their daughter. It was more than enough to illuminate their way forward, together,